The arena was silent. A heavy, unspoken weight pressed down on Ronald as he stood, bloodied but unbroken, in the center of the stone circle. He had seen worse days, but never like this. The crowd, a sea of alien faces, waited for the inevitable. The Vardians demanded blood, but Ronald wasn't going to give them what they expected. His opponent, a hulking creature with a horned skull and sinewy muscles, lunged forward. The crowd roared, hungry for the spectacle. It was always about the show, the blood, the violence. For them, it didn't matter who won as long as someone fell. But Ronald had no intention of feeding that beastly desire. He wasn't a gladiator. He wasn't some puppet for their amusement. The creature swung wildly, the force of each blow shaking the ground beneath him. Ronald ducked, narrowly avoiding a wide swipe. His heart pounded, but he wasn't afraid. He fought in too many wars, seen too many horrors to fear death. He wasn't sure if he was afraid of losing anymore, just that he couldn't let the crowd win. The creature's rage made it sloppy, and that was all the opening Ronald needed. With a swift motion, he twisted and drove his knee into the beast's ribs. There was a sickening crack. The crowd went silent. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The creature dropped to its knees, gasping for air. Ronald didn't wait. He drove a punch into its throat, then another. Bone cracked. The creature crumpled, lifeless. The crowd's roar was deafening, but this wasn't the victory Ronald wanted. He stood over the body, the weight of what he had just done sinking in. He wasn't a monster. But now, in the eyes of these aliens, he was something they'd never forget. Without a word, he turned his back and walked toward the edge of the arena. His payment, a small pile of credits, was tossed at his feet by a Vidian official. He didn't look at them. He just scooped them up, his mind already somewhere else, somewhere away from the blood-stained sands. A shadow blocked his path as he reached the tunnel leading to the underbelly of the arena. Ronald's hand instinctively went to the hilt of the knife strapped to his side, but the figure in front of him wasn't hostile. "Ronald," the voice called. The alien, tall and thin, dressed in polished armor, wasn't one of the usual officials. "Lady Mara requests your presence." Ronald didn't stop. He wasn't interested in playing their games. "She is of the ruling Vidian house," the lackey continued, stepping into his path. "Refusing is unwise." That stopped Ronald in his tracks. He turned slowly, studying the alien. "Who?" "Lady Mara, she saw what you did in the pit," the lackey pressed. "She doesn't summon just anyone." The mention of someone of high status caught his attention. He studied the lackey for a long moment, then turned back toward the tunnel. The lackey moved to block his way again. "You may not like this, but she needs you alive." The words were quiet, like a threat wrapped in politeness. Ronald stared at him. Then, without a word, he turned and followed. Ronald has just defeated his opponent in the arena, refusing to kill for the crowd's bloodlust. As he walks away, a mysterious figure informs him that Lady Mara, a noblewoman from the ruling Vidian house, has requested his presence. He reluctantly follows, but his future is about to change in ways he can't yet comprehend. The corridor smelled of damp stone and old blood, a stark contrast to the pristine, gleaming floors of the arena above. The walls seemed to close in around Ronald as he followed the lackey through the winding passageways beneath the arena. His footsteps echoed, but the silence in his mind was louder. Why had Lady Mara asked for him? He'd barely even registered the significance of the name. All he knew was that he was a human, one of the few to ever step into the arena, and that the Vardians didn't typically invite people like him into their world. He wasn't naive enough to think it was because of some newfound respect. There was something else at play here, and he didn't know if it was worth finding out. They turned a corner, and suddenly the sound of distant voices reached his ears. A low hum, like the buzz of an energy field, permeated the air. The passage opened into a large chamber. At the far end, a platform overlooked what seemed to be the underbelly of the arena, a place where Vardian officials and noble families came to witness the entertainment below. The room was dim, lit only by the pale glow of crystal veins running through the walls, the soft hum of power hanging in the air like a thick fog. At the center of the room, atop a raised dais, stood Lady Mara. She was tall, even by Vidian standards, with sharp, angular features and dark eyes that gleamed with intelligence and something else, something that felt dangerous. Her black robes, adorned with streaks of metallic gold, swayed gently in the air as she turned to face Ronald. "Come forward." Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a command that carried weight. Ronald stepped into the room, his boots tapping softly against the floor. The lackey, who had led him here, nodded respectfully before stepping aside. He didn't speak again, leaving Ronald to face the woman who had summoned him. Mara's eyes appraised him, her gaze flicking over his blood-soaked clothes, the bruises already starting to form on his skin. She didn't flinch. "You're the one who refused to kill in the pit." She said it like a statement, not a question. Ronald nodded, standing tall despite the fatigue that weighed on him. "I don't kill for sport." A flicker of approval passed through her eyes. "You're not like the others. They fight for the blood of the crowd. You fight for something else." Ronald shifted his weight, uncomfortable under her scrutiny. "You wanted me alive for some reason. What's it to you?" She smiled faintly, but it wasn't warm. "You've made quite an impression. You've sparked something, Ronald, something I didn't expect." Ronald narrowed his eyes. "And what is that?" "A choice," Mara said simply. She stepped down from the dais, moving toward him with deliberate grace. Her footsteps were silent, as though she were part of the shadows themselves. "The Vidian Council has ruled this land for centuries. We have kept order, upheld the old ways, but those old ways are starting to crumble. Your defiance in the pit, it has given others hope." Ronald felt a twinge of confusion. "Hope for what?" "A rebellion," Mara replied, her voice steady. "A revolution, if you will." The word hung in the air like a weight. Ronald knew what she was asking, what she was suggesting. But he wasn't a leader. He was a survivor. The idea of fighting an entire system, a power as ancient and powerful as the Vidian Council, seemed impossible. But he had already made enemies here, and there was something about Mara's presence, her quiet intensity, that made him hesitate. "You're asking me to fight," Ronald said, his voice flat. Mara's gaze softened, but only slightly. "Not just you, Ronald. We need you because you are a symbol. You stood against them and the people saw it. You didn't flinch when the stones were thrown. You bled for someone else and they saw that too." Ronald clenched his fists, his mind racing. "And what happens if I say no?" Her expression hardened. "Then they will come for you, they will come for everyone like you, and this, defiance, will burn out before it even has a chance to spread." He didn't respond at first. He wasn't sure what to say. He wasn't a revolutionary. He wasn't the man to lead an uprising. He was just a soldier trying to get by in a strange world. But he'd seen the way the Vardians treated those beneath them, how they used tradition as a tool of oppression, how they crushed dissent without a second thought. He couldn't let that happen. "All right," Ronald said, his voice low but firm. "What do you need me to do?" Mara's lips curved into a small, satisfied smile. "Good. I'm glad you see reason. We will need to move quickly before the Council tightens its grip. You've already drawn attention, and not just from the Council. There are others who want to see this revolution succeed." She gestured to a side door, and Ronald followed her as she led him into a smaller, more private room. It was lined with maps and holographic projections of the city, the surrounding districts, and the control points held by the Vidian Council. "The plan," Mara began, turning to face him, "is simple though dangerous. We need to cut off the Council's main supply routes. If we can disrupt their power, their food, their weapons, it will force them to the negotiating table, or we can overthrow them completely." "And where do I fit into all this?" Ronald asked, still unsure of his role. Mara studied him for a moment. "You're the spark. You've already proven that. People believe in you. We need you to lead them." "Leads," Ronald laughed bitterly. "I'm not a leader." "Then be something else," Mara countered. "Be the symbol they need, the man who can stand against the impossible, the one who doesn't break." Ronald felt a flicker of something inside him, an ember that had long been buried beneath years of war and survival. Something about her words stirred him, made him question everything he had believed about himself. Mara's eyes softened for a moment. "You don't have to do this alone, Ronald. I will be with you, but you have to make a choice. Will you stand with us, or will you stand against everything we are trying to build?" Lady Mara reveals her plan to use Ronald as a symbol for a growing rebellion against the Vidian Council. She offers him a chance to be part of something bigger than himself, a revolution. As the weight of the decision presses on him, Ronald stands at a crossroads. Will he take the risk and lead the charge for change, or will he turn away from the challenge ahead? The weight of the decision sat heavily on Ronald's shoulders. Mara's words echoed in his mind as they walked through the quiet, dimly lit corridors of the Vidian stronghold. He could feel the eyes of the guards on him, their silent vigilance adding to the tension in the air. Every step he took felt like it carried the burden of 1,000 decisions he hadn't made yet. He had never thought of himself as a symbol. He was a fighter, a survivor, someone who kept his head down and stayed alive no matter the cost. But now, standing in the heart of the Vidian stronghold, he was being asked to become something else. He was being asked to lead a revolution. Ronald, Mara's voice broke through his thoughts. He turned to her. She was walking beside him, her long black robes flowing as they moved through the maze of halls. Her eyes were sharp, but there was a softness to them now, a quiet urgency. "You're thinking too much," she said, offering him a small, knowing smile. "I can see it. You don't have to decide everything right now." "I'm not a leader, Mara," Ronald replied, his voice low. "I've never been. I'm just trying to survive, to stay alive. This isn't what I do." "Then be the one who doesn't flinch," she said simply. "The one who stands when everyone else falls, the one who fights for something more than himself." Ronald looked at her, her words striking deeper than he cared to admit. He wasn't a man of ideals, never had been. He fought to survive, for the men beside him, for the families he once had. But to fight for an entire world, one that didn't even belong to him. "What about you?" he asked, his voice soft. "What makes you any different?" Mara paused, her eyes meeting his. "I've seen what happens when you kneel to power. I've lived through it. My family ruled this world once, and we've seen it all fall apart. Jax," she said the name with distaste, "is not the kind of ruler this planet needs. He crushes the weak to stay on top." She stopped in front of a door and gestured for Ronald to follow her inside. As they stepped into the room, the air felt different. There was an energy here, an undercurrent of quiet activity. People moved around them, preparing, setting up equipment, talking in hushed tones. It was clear they were getting ready for something. "We don't just fight for a cause, Ronald," Mara continued, her voice more serious now. "We fight for our home, for the people who have been forgotten, discarded by the very system that claims to protect them. This isn't just about politics. It's about survival, about honor." She looked at him with an intensity that caught him off guard. "Will you fight for them?" Ronald felt a strange weight settle in his chest. He had always been a man who acted on instinct, who kept moving, kept fighting without thinking too hard about it. But here, in this room, surrounded by people who believed in something larger than themselves, something he could barely comprehend, he was forced to confront the question he'd been running from. Could he? Before he could answer, one of the rebels, a wiry alien with silvery skin, approached them. His eyes were wide with nervous energy, his voice shaking with urgency. "We've got a problem," the rebel said, his tone quick and strained. "Jax's men are on the move. They're sweeping through the lower districts. It's happening faster than we thought. The council knows about the unrest, about what happened in the arena." Ronald's heart skipped a beat. Jax's soldiers were ruthless. They wouldn't hesitate to burn entire districts to the ground to keep their power. Mara's face hardened, her eyes narrowing. "I knew this would happen." She turned to Ronald, her gaze intense. "This is it. They'll start with the markets, then move to the industrial sector. We can't let them take control of the lower districts again. They'll use force we can't match, not directly, but we have something they don't." She turned back to the rebel. "Prepare the team, we'll hit them where it hurts." Ronald felt his pulse quicken. This was real. The fight wasn't some far-off idea anymore. It wasn't just about standing in front of a crowd or sparring in an arena. It was about taking action, fighting for something bigger than himself. But he wasn't sure what he was walking into. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice low. Mara gave him a look, her eyes flickering with something close to a smile. "We don't have a choice." As the rebel moved to coordinate with others, Ronald's mind raced. He had never fought in a real resistance. He had fought in wars, sure, but they were about survival, about keeping the line from breaking. This was different. This wasn't just about him. It was about an entire world, an entire people, fighting for a future they didn't yet have. "Come," Mara said, her voice pulling him back to the present. "It's time." The city of Vardia was a sprawling labyrinth of towering crystal spires and wide streets, a place of beauty and danger in equal measure. The air shimmered with the pulse of energy that powered the city's ancient technology, the same energy that kept the Vidian Council in control. Below the gleaming towers lay the lower districts, the slums, where the workers, the fighters, the forgotten ones, lived in squalor. Mara's plan was simple: disrupt Jax's forces by cutting off the city's supply chain. They had already begun to make moves on the outskirts, and it was only a matter of time before they hit the more vulnerable sectors. This was their chance to strike first. As they moved through the city's back alleys, Ronald couldn't help but feel the tension building. He had never been part of a resistance, never fought for a cause like this. He had always fought to stay alive, to survive. But something about the quiet determination in Mara's eyes made him want to believe, just for a moment, that maybe this time it wasn't just about survival. They reached a makeshift meeting point at the edge of the district. A large, abandoned warehouse sat at the center, its crumbling walls an eyesore in the otherwise pristine city. Rebels moved in and out of the building, preparing weapons, checking gear, organizing supplies. Ronald felt the weight of the moment settle on him. This wasn't a game, this was real, and if they failed... He didn't want to think about what would happen if they failed. Mara gave him a nod as they entered the warehouse, and a wave of whispers washed over them. People turned their heads, eyes flickering with a mixture of hope and fear. He could see it in their eyes, their belief that something could change, that they could win. But Ronald knew better than most. There were no guarantees in war. He had learned that the hard way. He walked into the heart of the warehouse, where a map of the city was spread out on a large table. Mara was already discussing strategy with her closest advisors, her voice calm, methodical, but Ronald could see the fire in her eyes. She wasn't just leading a rebellion. She was fighting for something that mattered. Something he was starting to believe in. "Ronald," Mara said, glancing up as he approached, "we'll need you to be the distraction." Mara reveals her plan to disrupt Jax's forces by targeting the city's supply chain. As Ronald enters a rebel meeting point, he begins to realize the enormity of the situation he's stepped into. The weight of the revolution falls on him, and he's tasked with being the distraction. The tension is rising. Can they pull it off, or will Jax's forces crush them before they even begin? Ronald's stomach churned as Mara's words sank in, be the distraction. It sounded simple enough, but there was nothing simple about it. He wasn't a strategist, not a man who planned out revolutions. He was a soldier, a fighter. And the last thing he wanted to do was get caught in the crossfire of something this big. But Mara's eyes, that quiet, determined fire behind them, made it hard to say no. Still, he wasn't entirely sure how he felt about becoming the bait. The warehouse was a chaotic flurry of activity. Rebels, young and old, all prepared for something that felt monumental, yet terrifying. There was an energy in the air, a buzz of anxious hope. Soldiers checked weapons, patched up equipment, and exchanged hushed words. In the middle of it all, Mara was the calm center, pulling together threads of a plan that seemed as delicate as it was dangerous. "Ronald," she called, her voice steady in the midst of the chaos. "We've set up an ambush near the old wind farms. We've got enough firepower to make them think it's an all-out attack. But it's only a diversion. We'll hit their supply convoy before they can retaliate." Ronald nodded, glancing over the rebel fighters preparing themselves. He could tell they were ready for a fight. But they weren't soldiers, not like he had been. They had passion, but no real combat experience, not the kind that counted when the stakes were this high. "Where do I come in?" Ronald asked, keeping his voice low. His hand instinctively went to the knife at his belt. Mara gave him a sharp, knowing look. "You'll cause a scene, disrupt their response, make sure their attention stays focused on you long enough for us to strike." He thought about it for a moment. "And how do you expect me to do that?" "By being exactly who you are," she said with a hint of a smile. "Loud, tough, and impossible to ignore." Impossible to ignore. Great. That was just what he needed, more attention from the people trying to kill him. Before he could protest, one of the rebel commanders, a grizzled Vardian with thick green skin, stepped forward. His expression was stern, his voice thick with authority. "The convoy will be escorted by 12 of Jax's best. Our team will need to move fast. Once we take down the first 2 trucks, the rest will scatter. Your job is to buy us time. They'll expect someone to make a move, and it's going to be you." Ronald swallowed the lump in his throat. His job was to stand in the open, get their attention, and make sure they didn't stop what they were doing. It was risky, damn risky, but there was no backing out now. "I'll do it," he said finally, his voice hardening. "But I need a damn good weapon." Mara smiled, her eyes narrowing as she turned toward a weapons rack against the wall. "We've got just the thing." The wind farms loomed in the distance, massive turbines cutting the air as they spun, their blades creaking in the wind. Ronald could see the convoy in the distance. A small army of trucks moving along the road, heavily armed soldiers scattered in the convoy's wake, scanning the horizon. He was hiding behind a pile of crates, the dusty smell of the wind stinging his nose. The rebels had set up their ambush to the side of the road, hidden in the shadows of the wind turbines. Marer and the others were positioned along the route, ready to take out the convoy when the time came. Ronald adjusted his grip on the pulse rifle, his heart pounding in his chest. The weapon felt heavy in his hands, the unfamiliar weight of it reminding him just how much he didn't belong here. "Ready?" Marer's voice crackled over the communicator in his ear. "Yeah, let's get this over with," Ronald replied, his voice gruff. He peeked around the corner of the crates, watching the convoy draw closer. The soldiers in the lead truck were oblivious, focused on the road ahead. But they weren't going to be for long. Ronald had no intention of letting them pass without noticing him. He took a deep breath and stepped out into the open, his boots crunching on the gravel. A few of the soldiers glanced in his direction, their eyes narrowing with confusion. Ronald raised the pulse rifle to his shoulder, took aim, and fired a single shot into the air. The blast rang out, reverberating through the wind-swept plains. The soldiers jerked, the confusion turning into alertness. Ronald squeezed the trigger again, sending another shot into the sky. "Hey," one of the soldiers shouted, raising his rifle. "What's this idiot doing?" Ronald's heart raced, the weight of the moment pressing on him. He had one shot at this. He raised the rifle again, aiming at the lead truck, and fired. The blast hit the side of the truck with a satisfying explosion of sparks. The vehicle veered to the side, its tires screeching as it fought to stay on course. Now Marer's voice crackled in his earpiece. "Go." Ronald sprinted toward the convoy, firing at the soldiers as they scrambled to react. His shots weren't aimed to kill, not yet, but they were enough to keep the soldiers off balance. A few soldiers ducked behind their trucks, others scrambling for cover. The plan was in motion. Ronald could see the rebel fighters emerging from their hiding places, moving with precision. The first truck in the convoy came to a screeching halt, blocking the road. Explosions rang out as the rebels began their assault. The second truck was hit, smoke rising from its engine, the convoy in chaos. But the soldiers weren't stupid. They regrouped quickly, organizing to fight back. "Ronald," Marer's voice snapped through the comms. "They're getting organized, you need to pull them off us." Ronald nodded, even though she couldn't see him. He wasn't sure if he could do this. He wasn't sure if he could be the target, the center of attention, long enough for the rebels to finish their work. But there was no turning back. He raised his pulse rifle again, aimed at the soldiers preparing to fire on the rebels, and opened fire. The soldiers returned fire, their shots whizzing by his head, some striking the ground near him, kicking up dirt and debris. But Ronald didn't stop. He fired again and again, making himself a clear target for every soldier within a mile. One soldier tried to flank him, moving from behind a nearby truck, but Ronald heard him coming. He pivoted, firing at the man's chest before he could get a shot off. The soldier dropped, the dust rising around him. Another soldier rushed him from the opposite side, but Ronald was faster. He dodged, slamming the stock of his rifle into the soldier's jaw, sending him sprawling to the ground. He kicked the soldier's rifle away and kept moving, staying low, forcing the soldiers to keep their eyes on him. The ambush was working. The rebels had taken out 2 of the trucks, but now the remaining soldiers were getting organized. Their resistance was tougher than he'd anticipated. "Ronald, fall back," Marer called urgently. "We've done what we can, get out of there." But Ronald wasn't sure he could. He could hear the heavy boots of more soldiers approaching from the rear. They were closing in. "Not yet," he muttered to himself. "I've still got time." But how much? Ronald takes his place as the distraction in the heart of the ambush, risking his life to give the rebels time to take down the convoy. As chaos erupts around him, the soldiers fight back with surprising force. Ronald is caught in the middle, and with more soldiers closing in, it's unclear whether he'll make it out alive, let alone if the mission will succeed. Ronald's heart pounded in his chest as he sprinted across the rocky plain, his pulse rifle heavy in his hands, his thoughts racing. The initial shock of the attack had faded into a brutal, desperate fight for survival. The sound of gunfire, the crack of pulse rounds slicing through the air, filled his ears as he dodged behind another cluster of crates. He had to keep moving. He couldn't afford to get pinned down, not now, not when the stakes were so high. The rebels had taken out 2 of the trucks, but the rest of the convoy was still operational. The soldiers were getting organized. They were getting smarter. And the longer he stayed out in the open, the more likely it was that he wouldn't make it out of this alive. Ronald, Mara's voice crackled through the communicator, tight with urgency. They're calling in reinforcements. You need to get out of there. Now. I'm working on it, Ronald grunted, peering over the top of a crate. A few soldiers were trying to flank him, circling the area, their eyes darting between the rebels and him. He had to buy them more time, but how much longer could he keep the attention on himself? Another pulse round ricocheted off the crate near his head, and he ducked instinctively, heart skipping a beat. He was getting too close. The soldiers were starting to close in, surrounding him on all sides. He was in the open, and it wasn't going to take long for them to overwhelm him. You can't keep doing this, Ronald. Mara's voice was louder now, more insistent. We've done what we came for. The rest of the convoy is finished. We need you back here. Ronald swallowed, glancing back at the wreckage of the first two trucks. Smoke billowed into the sky, but there was still a problem. The soldiers weren't retreating. They were tightening their grip. The rebels needed to finish what they started, but the longer Ronald held his position, the more dangerous it became for everyone. Just a little longer, he muttered, mostly to himself. He needed a plan, something more than just running and gunning, something that would force the soldiers to retreat. His eyes scanned the area, searching for something, anything, that would give him an edge. Then he saw it. A group of soldiers was huddling behind one of the remaining trucks, moving quickly to set up a perimeter. They weren't expecting him to come from the other side. Ronald adjusted his position, moving to the far side of the crate, and took a deep breath. It was risky, it was reckless, but it might just work. He broke cover, sprinting toward the edge of the battlefield, his body low and fast. Shots whizzed past him, some too close for comfort. He reached the far end of the convoy and took cover behind a large piece of machinery. He could see the soldiers clearly now, 3 of them, their rifles trained on the rebel fighters farther down the road. He didn't hesitate, he fired. The shot hit one of the soldiers square in the chest, and he crumpled instantly. The others turned, confused and startled by the sudden attack. Ronald didn't wait to see their reactions. He rolled to his feet and dashed across the open space, closing the distance between him and the soldiers. "Get down," one of the soldiers shouted as he tried to take aim. Ronald dove forward, slamming into the soldier's legs and taking him down with a brutal strike to the side. His rifle flew from his hands as he hit the dirt, and Ronald didn't waste any time. He grabbed the man's weapon and shoved it in his face, pulling the trigger before the soldier could react. The second soldier hesitated, and that was all Ronald needed. He took him out with a clean shot, the sound of the pulse rifle cutting through the air like a whip. Only one soldier remained. He had already started retreating, realizing that his team was falling apart. Ronald lunged, catching the soldier's arm and pulling him into the dirt. The soldier grunted, trying to fight back, but Ronald slammed his knee into his chest, knocking the wind out of him. "Where do you think you're going?" Ronald spat, grabbing the soldier by the collar and lifting him off the ground. The soldier was gasping for air, his eyes wide with fear. "You're crazy, you can't win this." "We'll see about that," Ronald growled, tossing the soldier aside and watching as he scrambled to his feet and ran for cover. But before Ronald could fire another shot, a loud, deafening explosion ripped through the air, shaking the ground beneath his feet. The entire convoy went up in flames. The remaining trucks, the supply crates, everything. It was a complete and utter destruction of the Vidian supply line. Ronald froze, his mind racing. What the hell had just happened? "Ronald," Mara's voice came through his earpiece, frantic. "We did it. We hit the rest of the convoy. The council won't be able to respond to this in time. We've bought the people a chance." Ronald stood still, staring at the chaos unfolding before him. Smoke billowed into the sky, and the once pristine road was now littered with burning wreckage. The soldiers that had been so determined to fight had either been defeated or were scrambling to escape. But there was something else happening, something more sinister. "Ronald," Mara's voice cracked through the comms again, her tone serious. "We've got company." Ronald's heart skipped a beat as he turned, scanning the horizon. In the distance, a large group of vehicles was approaching. He didn't need to see the insignia to know who they were. Jax's reinforcements. A group of heavily armored trucks, the Vidian Council's elite soldiers, were barreling down the road toward him. He had no time to get back to the rebels, no time to retreat. He was trapped in the middle, and there was only one way out. He sprinted back toward the wind farm's turbines, his mind racing. The rebels had bought time, he had bought them time, but now it was about to get much worse. Mara's voice crackled in his ear again, urgent but steady. "You need to get to the rendezvous point. They're coming for you, Ronald, and they're not going to stop until they've found you." Ronald's breath hitched as he turned, scanning the horizon. He was alone, outnumbered, but he was never one to run. "Then let them come," he muttered, his hands tightening on his pulse rifle. Ronald's reckless diversion has worked. He's taken out a group of soldiers and successfully disrupted the convoy. But just as victory seems within reach, reinforcements arrive, and the full might of Jax's forces is closing in on him. He's trapped with no easy escape, and the stakes are higher than ever. Will he survive the oncoming assault, or will the revolution come to an end before it truly begins? The wind howled through the cracked blades of the turbines as Ronald sprinted toward the wind farm's farthest edge, his legs aching, his breath ragged. He could hear the rumbling of engines in the distance, a deep, foreboding sound that sent a chill down his spine. Jax's reinforcements were closing in. He wasn't sure how many were coming, but he didn't need to know. What mattered was that they were coming for him, and they weren't going to stop until he was dead. His mind raced. The rebels had succeeded in their part. They had taken out the convoy, struck a blow against the Vidian supply lines. But now it was all about survival. There was no more room for error. He wasn't sure if he could make it back to the rendezvous point in time. He had to rely on the rebels to cover his escape, but they had their hands full. Jax wasn't one to leave anything to chance, and the elite soldiers in those armored trucks would stop at nothing to hunt him down. Ronald ducked behind a large turbine, pressing his back against the cold, metallic surface. His pulse rifle was still clutched in his hands, but it felt useless now. The trucks were too close, too many soldiers. He couldn't fight them all, not without backup, and there was no backup coming. He peered cautiously around the turbine, scanning the horizon. In the distance, the convoy of armored trucks was barreling down the road, their headlights piercing the darkness. At least 24 soldiers, all armed to the teeth, and they were heading straight for him. There was no time to waste, no time to think. Ronald gritted his teeth, pushing off from the turbine and sprinting toward a nearby rocky outcrop. He needed to stay low, stay out of sight, but he couldn't help but feel the weight of every step. This wasn't a battle he was going to win with force. He had to outsmart them. He had to make them pay for every inch they took from him. "Ronald, are you there?" Mara's voice crackled in his ear again, sharp with urgency. "I'm here," he grunted, his voice strained. "I've got company, a lot of company. I need backup now." "We're on our way, but you're not going to have much time," Mara said, her voice tight. "Head toward the canyon on the south side of the farm. There's a narrow pass there. If you can hold them off long enough, we can meet you there." "Understood," Ronald replied, already heading in the direction she mentioned. He didn't have a choice. The canyon was his only hope. The narrow pass would give him cover, give him time. But it also meant he'd be trapped. If they caught up with him, there would be no escape. He ran faster, pushing his body to the limit, ignoring the pain that screamed in his muscles. The sound of the trucks grew louder, the vibrations of their engines shaking the ground beneath his feet. Every step he took felt like it brought him closer to his end. But there was no turning back. He reached the canyon's edge, the jagged rocks and deep shadows offering some semblance of cover. The path was narrow, and he knew the trucks couldn't follow him directly through it. But the soldiers would. They would surround him. He slowed, taking a deep breath, trying to steady his thoughts. His hand trembled as he checked his pulse rifle. The energy pack was low. He had maybe a few shots left before it ran dry. The weight of it settled heavily in his gut. But he didn't have time to think about that now. Ronald crouched low behind a rock, the wind biting at his skin as he waited. His senses were on high alert, his every nerve stretched thin. He could hear the trucks in the distance, now close enough to see their headlights reflecting off the canyon walls. "Stay focused," he muttered to himself, his grip tightening on the rifle. "Stay alive." He peered around the rock, watching as the first of Jax's soldiers poured into the canyon. The armored trucks had stopped at the entrance, blocking the way. The soldiers moved with precision, their guns raised, their eyes scanning the shadows. They were closing in inch by inch. Ronald didn't hesitate. He fired the first shot. It hit one of the soldiers square in the chest, sending him sprawling to the ground. The others scattered, taking cover behind rocks and debris. Ronald's heart raced, but he kept his cool, moving quickly between positions, firing when he had the chance, forcing the soldiers to keep their heads down. But for every soldier he took out, 3 more appeared, flanking him from different angles. They weren't just soldiers, They were trained hunters, relentless in their pursuit. His pulse rifle clicked empty. He had nothing left. He dropped the rifle and grabbed the nearest rock, hurling it at the soldiers. The rock flew through the air, striking one of them in the face, knocking him off balance. Ronald dove forward, slamming into the soldier's chest and knocking him to the ground. A quick strike to the throat ended it. But the odds were stacking up against him. He could hear more soldiers moving into the canyon, their footsteps echoing off the walls. They were tightening their noose. And then he heard something else. The unmistakable sound of boots, heavy and deliberate, echoing from behind. "Ronald," Mara's voice broke through his earpiece again, frantic. "We're almost there, but you need to hold them off. You can't let them reach you." Ronald gritted his teeth. His arms were heavy, his legs sore, but he wasn't done yet. He wasn't going to let them win. He turned toward the incoming soldiers, his gaze steely and focused. He didn't know how much longer he could keep this up, but he wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not after everything they had sacrificed to get this far. He picked up another rock, ready to fight until his last breath. But then something unexpected happened. A loud crack echoed across the canyon, followed by a blinding flash of light. The ground beneath Ronald's feet trembled as a massive explosion erupted from behind the soldiers. The shockwave hit him, throwing him to the ground, the sound of the blast deafening. Through the smoke, Ronald saw it. An armored vehicle, its engine roaring as it plowed into the soldiers, scattering them in all directions. And then out of the smoke, a familiar figure emerged. Mara. She was at the wheel, her eyes sharp and focused as she drove the vehicle straight into the heart of Jax's forces. Behind her, the rest of the rebels were close behind, their weapons raised, ready to finish the job. "You're late," Ronald said, his voice strained as he pushed himself to his feet. Mara grinned, her eyes gleaming with relief. "Would you have it any other way?" Just when Ronald's situation seemed hopeless, Mara and the rebels arrive in the nick of time, launching a surprise attack on Jax's forces. But the battle is far from over. Jax's soldiers are regrouping, and the final push is coming. Can Ronald and the rebels hold their ground, or will this be the end of their revolution? The air was thick with dust and smoke, the remnants of the explosion still hanging in the canyon like a choking veil. Ronald barely had time to register the sudden shift in the tide before Mara's armored vehicle came screeching around the corner, plowing through the remaining soldiers with unrelenting force. The massive wheels crushed debris and sent soldiers scattering like ants before a storm. Ronald didn't hesitate. He picked himself up, wiping the blood and dust from his face, and sprinted toward the vehicle, his legs trembling but his resolve solidifying. His heart still raced, but now it wasn't fear, it was adrenaline. Mara's face was set in a tight, determined line as she slammed the vehicle into park, the engine still roaring behind her. The rebel fighters spilled out behind her, weapons raised, ready for whatever came next. Their arrival had shifted the balance of the fight, but Jax's forces weren't defeated yet. "Come on," Mara shouted, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rumbling engine. "We don't have much time, keep pushing." Ronald, now back on his feet and steadied by the presence of the rebels, followed her without a word. They were regrouping fast. The canyon was a battlefield now, the twisted bodies of soldiers and rebels scattered across the rocky terrain. But there was something in the air. The rebels had felt it too. The momentum had shifted. "Jax's forces are retreating," a rebel soldier reported from the comms unit, his voice crackling with static but tinged with disbelief. "They're pulling back, heading toward the eastern ridge. They're not staying for a prolonged fight." Ronald shot Mara a sharp look, brow furrowed in confusion. "Why, they don't retreat, not this easily." Mara's eyes narrowed, scanning the distance as she reloaded her pulse rifle. "Because they know they're losing, and they're not stupid. They know reinforcements won't come in time. They'll regroup and try to dig in further east, but we've got them on the ropes." Ronald didn't respond, his instincts kicking in. He had been in enough firefights to know that a retreat wasn't always an easy victory. It was a delay, a chance for the enemy to regroup, to re-strategize. He had no illusions about this battle being over, not yet. But the sight of Jax's soldiers retreating felt like something he hadn't allowed himself to hope for. He turned, motioning to a nearby rebel commander. "How far out are the reinforcements?" "Not far," the commander responded, eyes grim. "We've got a few more minutes before they reach us, but it won't be enough to push us back now. We've made our stand." Ronald knew they had to press the advantage. They had to finish what they started before Jax's forces could turn things around. "I'll head to the ridge," he said. "Keep pushing forward, we don't stop until they're out of the canyon." Mara glanced at him, her expression unreadable for a moment. "Be careful," she said, her voice steady but laced with something else, something he couldn't quite decipher. "They'll be expecting you." "Then I'll give them something they won't expect." Ronald gave her a half grin, one born from years of fighting and surviving against impossible odds. Without waiting for her to reply, he turned and headed toward the ridge. The rebel fighters followed, the low hum of their weapons the only sound as they moved swiftly, strategically toward the higher ground. The ridge was narrow, rocky. It offered little cover, but it gave them the height they needed to see the battlefield from above. They crept along the edge, moving cautiously, aware that Jax's forces were regrouping just on the other side. The tension in the air was palpable. The fight wasn't over, not yet, but it was close. Ronald reached the crest of the ridge and stopped, crouching low to avoid being seen. Below, Jax's soldiers were setting up a defensive perimeter, but they looked disorganized. They were still in retreat, still rattled by the unexpected assault. The sight of them, scrambling to hold their ground, was enough to give Ronald a brief surge of hope. He gestured for the rebels to take position, and they spread out, preparing for the final push. "They're almost there," the rebel commander muttered, his rifle trained on the enemy. "We take them out now and we win this." Ronald nodded, his mind focused on the task ahead. He had no illusions about victory being guaranteed, but he knew they were close. The pieces were falling into place. They just needed to hit fast and hard. Suddenly, a loud crack split the air. A shot fired from the enemy's line, and Ronald felt the impact before he even heard the sound. The ground beneath him shook and his vision blurred. He staggered, his legs giving way beneath him. He gasped for air, his hand instinctively reaching for his chest. The shot had caught him, his side just below the ribs. The blood dripped hot and sticky, staining his shirt as his breath came in sharp gasps. "Ronald," Mara's voice echoed over the comms. "Get back here, you're hit." He gritted his teeth, fighting the pain. He couldn't fall back now, not when they were so close. "I'm fine," he managed, his voice raspy but determined. "Keep going." With his heart hammering, he forced himself to stand, ignoring the searing pain in his side. He could hear the shouts of the rebels, the frantic calls to press forward. And then in the distance he saw it, the armored trucks that had been backing up the retreating soldiers, Jax's reinforcements. It was now or never. Ronald pushed himself up onto his feet, ignoring the darkness threatening to pull him under. His pulse rifle felt heavier than ever, but he lifted it, aiming it at the soldiers rushing to their positions below. He fired, the shot taking down one of the soldiers as the rest scattered for cover. "Now," he shouted, his voice hoarse but forceful. The rebels surged forward, their fire synchronized, sweeping across the ridge. Jax's soldiers barely had time to react before they were overwhelmed. The tide had turned. And then, just as quickly as it had started, it was over. The soldiers were retreating again, breaking ranks and fleeing into the distance. The armored trucks had been neutralized. Jax's forces had been defeated. Ronald stood, breathing heavily, his body covered in sweat and blood. His side throbbed with every movement, but it didn't matter. They had won. Mara was at his side in an instant, her hand gripping his arm as she helped him steady himself. "You're hurt," she said, her voice gentle but concerned. "I'm fine," he said, though the words felt hollow in his mouth. He looked over the battlefield, his eyes scanning the wreckage of Jax's forces. "We did it." Mara's eyes softened as she looked at him, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "We did it together." Ronald nodded, feeling the weight of the battle lift off his shoulders. But as the dust settled and the rebels began to regroup, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The council wouldn't let this defeat go unanswered. But for now, for this moment, they had won. Ronald and the rebels have achieved a hard-fought victory, dealing a significant blow to Jax's forces. With the retreat of the Vidian soldiers and the destruction of their convoy, the revolution has gained momentum. But as Ronald looks over the battlefield, he knows this isn't the end. The fight for Vardia has only just begun. What happens next, only time will tell. But one thing is certain, they've sparked a flame that can't be put out.